You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count. Steve, today we are continuing with part 2 regarding CWD, and in our previous episode, part 1, we visited with people from Wisconsin and Illinois, and they told us about their experience for dealing with chronic wasting disease for almost 20 years. We have two gentlemen today, a little more in our neck of the woods, and they're going to be really, I guess, focusing on the state agency perspective.
Yeah, we got Jason Sumners, Missouri, former Deer Lab graduate student, and Missouri has had the disease for somewhere around 5 years, and it's a relatively low prevalence rate where it occurs. And then in contrast, our Arkansas friend,
Cory Gray.
Cory Gray, who's been dealing with it for about 5 years, but unknown to them, it's likely that the disease had been present in northwest Arkansas probably 15 or 20 years before they discovered it. So they had instantaneous high prevalence levels when they finally documented it. And those two guys are in the trenches dealing with this relatively new problem in their range of duties, and great perspectives.
Yeah. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome back, everybody, to Deer University. I'm Steve Damaris.
I'm Bronson Strickland.
And we have a really interesting episode for you today. We've had the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks CWD Roundtable here in Starkville, Mississippi at Mississippi State University. And we have two of the leading experts on chronic wasting disease from the state management agency perspective here in the Southeast. We have Jason Sumners, who's from Missouri, and he's basically the chief of the wildlife research division within the Missouri agency, and Cory Gray, who's in a similar position in Arkansas. And yesterday, or the last episode, we talked with Paul Shelton, who'd been dealing with chronic wasting disease 17 or 18 years.
Since 2002.
In Illinois.
Right.
And Brian Richards, who had been associated with it in Wisconsin for the same amount of time. And you two, Jason and Cory, have been involved in it probably longer than any other state agency in the Southeast, but still relatively new. You're kind of in that middle ground. So we're really interested in hearing your perspectives on a lot of different things. So welcome.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
One, as a state agency, and you two are a great mix from my point of view, Bronson. Agency representatives, you work for the management agency, but you're also coordinating the research effort into this disease, this chronic wasting disease. Can you kind of, Cory, talk a little bit about that role, that duality of job responsibility?
It is. In Arkansas, we have a great relationship with our wildlife management division. Those folks are basically the troops on the ground. We have our deer biologists, we have our elk biologists, and then we have tons of staff that's in the field that help us implement the plan. We do have a wildlife veterinarian, Dr. Jen Ballard, and she kind of oversees the direction of our CWD program. She kind of calls the shots, what I say. She's the general. And then once she develops a plan, then we start implementing the plan. But it takes a partnership, and even with us, and I'm sure Jason will say the same thing, is that CWD is an agency-wide event. And we've heard that yesterday, that you're going to have fish biologists standing there pulling lymph nodes. We have education staff sitting there providing water and snacks and whatever other needs for our biological staff. It is a true all hands-on effort in Arkansas, and I think Jason will say the same thing.
Yeah, no, it very much is. Yeah, everybody says the wildlife staff or the fishery staff, and I always say even the ladies that process our P cards in central office are part of our opening weekend mandatory sampling. It truly is a all hands on deck, and the public doesn't know any different. When you wear a triangle, you're a representative of the agency, and so they have some expectation that wherever they meet you that you know something. And so yeah, it truly becomes an agency-wide priority. And then one of the other things that has happened is our director has clearly said, this is an agency priority, and while you guys may have other things that you think are important, you're going to put the time aside to do what's necessary, and there's a role for everybody. Yeah, we may not expect somebody that's never handled a firearm to be doing targeted culling, but there's a role for you. You can keep data. You can help us make landowner maps. You can do those kinds of things. So yeah, it quickly becomes an agency priority, and everybody has to chip in because the workload becomes tremendous. I mean, it just becomes very overwhelming for staff.
Jason, I remember right after you got it or first detected it, you don't have it, first detected it in your state, you made a statement about this is not a sprint, it is...
Yeah, it's a marathon. Yeah, I think the passion, right? We all got into this, and many of us coming from a deer research background, wanted passionately care about the resource, and so it's kind of it's a day that many of us knew would come at some point, but you don't truly know when you get the positive. You're like, well, that's bad. But then you start doing the work, and then everything matters. Every decision you feel matters, and you charge out hard. And staff do too. They have that same clear passion for protecting the resource, and you got to be careful. And so when folks call, I think Cory called not long after they found it, and I said, Cory, take care of yourself and take care of staff, because you'll just run yourself into the ground. And that's truly the experience that we had, and many others have had. You talk about that burnout, and you get a year and a half in, and it's completely changed your life. You can't go to the gas station and not get questions. Staff are dealing with that every single day, and it just there's pre-CWD for the agency, and there is post-CWD for the agency.
That's very true. And I remember right where I was standing when the call came in, from our lab, and you start saying, okay, let's double check everything. Give me that number again. And then I was actually in North Carolina when it called, so I'm calling back to Arkansas saying, check the database again. And you're just trying to make sure that you heard correctly, you have a CWD positive animal. Because like Jason says, you've always been told the day's coming, but you never want to just say, well, all right, I'm ready for today to be that day. Because you invest so much into your career, in your profession. I mean, this is what we studied for, this is what we trained for, this is what we wanted to do ever since we were just small children, And then something happens to the resource that you've invested so much in. And it does, I took it personally. And it really kind of hurt me, on the way back, and we were talking about it, and I come home and I'm talking to my wife, which she has great sympathy for me, but it changes everything. Even her conversations in the grocery store, they'll say, what about Cory? Have you got any updates on CWD from Cory? and she has to say, well, I don't know the total number of positives right now or the counties, but it changes so much. And like Jason says, our staff, they have that zeal, and they want to go in there and they want to run to the fire and they want to try to put it out as quickly as they can. But they realize quickly with us as well, it does become a marathon. You've got to find your pace, and you've got to settle in and say, we got many miles ahead of us. Don't just try to run this quarter sprint here. You've got to settle in and run the whole thing, because if you don't, you're going to lose staff along the way. Your leadership, you've always got to be strong on your leadership, and I think that from us, that comes from our directorate down. And I'm very thankful that our directorate has realized that CWD is a priority for us. Our director just sent out a list of priorities for FY20, and CWD was on that list. And so you got to have that kind of support, but you got to realize that this fire is going to take a long time to fight. And we just need to make sure that we take care of our staff, take care of one another, continue to communicate. That's what I'm talking about today, is we cannot over-communicate this. Every time you get an opportunity at a gas station, Walmart, wherever you're at, talk CWD to someone. And just let them know that, yeah, it's a bad thing. We've been dealt a bad hand, but we're going to play it out. We're not going to fold and go to the house. We're going to go ahead and see this thing through, and we're gathering the best information that we can all along the way.
That's interesting. I think every one of us remember where we were at when we heard the word. Steve, you and I, we've said that before, where we were at, but there's always this, there was this time before, and then there was this day, and then with your career and your emotions about the resource and time after CWD. So we all take it serious, and I love how you've both used the word burnout. And so I'm wondering, because we've talked about the deer management world, about burnout and these types of things. I'm curious about, in your state's hunter burnout. And I know there's all this excitement, negative excitement at first, but people want to know, and then here's the plan and going forward. But now that y'all are years 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever into this, can you relay a little bit about how the hunters have responded, maybe some things that have resonated really well, some things that haven't, and kind of how you're going forward with that?
Yeah, I guess I'll start. We've been dealing with it a little bit longer. We founded a captive facility in 2010, and it really, we started communicating. This is the disease, really intensively communicating, and really only those local landowners right around that facility, or the couple of facilities, even started to be aware of the disease, despite the fact that we within the community have been talking about this thing since 2002, right, when it was found in Wisconsin. And so it was, it's in that facility, nothing to worry about. But then in 2012, when we found the free-ranging herd adjacent to it, we started that very intensive communication. And so, one of the lessons learned, we went and had an open house. An open house is a format that tries to keep the tenor of the room kind of calm. It can't be grandstanding. You can have just kind of open individual conversations with people. What we quickly figured out was, despite the fact that we'd written articles in our magazine, and we'd done news releases and radio interviews, those kinds of things, folks showed up, they had no idea what questions to ask. So we had to take the step back and say, all right, we have to engage with information. And so we started doing informational presentations. And as we found it in different spots, we quickly realized we had to give that same basic information, despite the fact that, literally written dozens of articles, done dozens of radio interviews across the state, and so thought that folks were aware of the issue, but it kind of quickly turned into Groundhog Day. It's like finding a new spot and you start over. But over the last couple of years, as we've identified some new places, the expectation of the depth of the presentations that we get and the information that we get, we've had folks say, well, what about this? What about this? So their understanding of the disease is becoming more sophisticated, and which I think is encouraging.
Absolutely.
And so the folks are slowly becoming more aware, but it's taken us finding it in nearly every administrative region that we have for that kind of to change. And so I don't know, Cory, if you guys have started to see that either.
Yeah, and with the internet now, and information is so easily obtainable, whether or not the information is accurate or not. But at least they're going to look at something. Now, I do think sometimes we have to do damage control because they'll come up and say, they've read something online, and we have to go back then and stick with the science. And that was one of the things with our communication is we always said, we're going to tell you what we know, even though that world may be a small place to live, that's where we're going to reside. And it's a day at a time process, and we're going to go to the science. Always go to the science. And, you know, they'll try to take you down all sorts of rabbit trails and all sorts of dark alleys, but we'd always try to get them right back to the science. But I think our hunters initially, especially in Newton County, they fully supported us. We went to them face-to-face meetings, and we said, here is what we know, and we need your help in managing this. And the residents of Newton County came out very strongly, and especially in our phase 1 efforts. Now I think time kind of dulls a lot of emotions maybe, and so now I don't know if we have that strong support. I think they're seeing that life continues on. I still see deer. I'm still harvesting deer. So I don't know if we would have that same, you know, vigor if we went back into Newton County again. But statewide, though, when you go, everybody seems to be somewhat alert of CWD, regardless if I'm in southeast Arkansas or I'm in the CWD zone. And we're really, this upcoming year, expanding our surveillance efforts statewide with our freezer system and things like that, because we do have those hunters like in Chico County that say, how do I get my deer tested? Even though they're 300 miles away from the CWD positive, they have a concern. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, you know, sometimes everything is a bell-shaped curve. So we've got those hunters on the far right that are overly sensitive to CWD. We've got some on the far left that don't even know what that is, and then you may have this large number in the middle that just want to go shoot a brown deer. Mm-hmm. And so, but one thing that we're really trying to sell this is the CWD testing is this part of the hunting experience. That scouting, setting up your deer stand, buying your hunting license, you know, sighting in your rifle, checking your game, testing your game, and then consuming your game. And we want it all just to be part of that hunting process that we've always done. We're just going to add another piece to the puzzle.
That's a really good point. You know, some states add telecheck, or, you know, there's always new changes in how deer are managed that hunters have to just accept and kind of roll with, and that's a really, really great point, Cory.
That's the message we're trying to get out is look, you just add it into what you already do. We all, as hunters, we all have these routines that we all go through to kind of get ourselves ready for game day here. And we just want this to be part of that conversation. And we want testing of CWD to be part of that action that they go through. We're going to make it as easy as we can. We're going to have a drop-off in every county. We're going to make it free of charge. We're going to do everything in our ability to help you insert that piece into your regime, but we hope that'll be successful.
It's kind of like, you know, the years and years working with people and convincing them that it's worth it to go back to the skin and shed. Here's how you extract a jawbone. This is why we do it. Mm-hmm. Here's how you, collect body weight, lactation data, antler dimensions. That is a really great way to explain it. This is just something, additional data that we ask them to collect. And one thing, you know, we always recommend is that with concerns about the meat and the consumption, it's a great peace of mind for you to know whether it has it or not. And they can make a decision, you know, whether they want to consume the meat or not. But also it's a contribution to deer management, to the State Wildlife Agency, to science at large, to know where the sample came from and it's positive or negative. So yeah, it's kind of the new reality of deer management. Yeah. What has been, I guess, if there's any rumors y'all have dealt with over the last few years, is there one thing that's persistent that shows up over and over, and like, you know, if you were huddled up, you know, your group of people and say, if we could just dispel that one myth or one or two myths, what are still some of the big challenges in that regard?
Well, yeah, there's several.
Yeah.
Where
I
we're
got
going to
two
start.
that popped up
Yeah,
quickly.
we'll see if they're the same. You know, to me, the biggest one is that CWD doesn't kill deer. I mean, to me, you know, part of the nature of the disease is that long incubation time and the reality that folks don't see and find dead deer. And so they find deer that have died of hemorrhagic disease, right? We're getting a little bit right now. And so they're finding those deer and they say, well, they don't die. Every deer I've shot looks healthy, and even many of the positive ones that we've shot look healthy. So what's the worry? What's the worry? And yeah, to me, that's one of the biggest hurdles that we've got to overcome. On a more local scale, we've dealt with some rumors about the source and origin of the positives. And I think here you guys have dealt a little bit with that first, the first one that died. It really set us back in a couple of our core areas. Just the rumor and speculation when you only find a single positive, and you've been communicating to the public that you've been doing very good surveillance. We're trying to detect it, and you got one positive. Then the rumor mill gets fired up. Well, that deer was killed in Macon County. He reported on a landowner tag locally, and it's dispelling that has been tremendously difficult. And so we've got one small core area where we just have very, very limited public support. It's like the only one, but it was because that rumor really grabbed hold in the local community, and despite the fact that we have found additional positives there, it's clear that the infection was there. It's been a challenging one for us to manage locally.
The two that came to my mind, one is the origin of our disease. Immediately they said Game and Fish, Arkansas Game and Fish brought this disease in when you brought in the elk, and we did. We brought in 112 elk from 1981 to 1985. Some of those came from Colorado, some came from Nebraska, but we don't know for certain whether or not any of those 113 were infected with chronic wasting disease. And so that's what we tell people is we don't know for certain. We may have, but we don't think so. Just the sheer, the growth, epidemiological growth of that disease, and then over time, and then just the 113, and what kind of poor luck that would be if one of them was actually positive. So we don't know, and I don't know if we'll ever have the luxury of knowing the origin of the disease. I think that's something we all grasp for, but I don't think we'll ever be afforded that. So we always try to bring people right back. Again, that may be a possibility, but regardless, the disease is still here. So eradicating the elk in North Arkansas is not going to solve the problem. So let's go ahead and keep that resource on the landscape. The second is there are some that out there that believe that since we have discovered CWD, that the Arkansas Game Fish has just received this landfall of federal money, and that we're just now rolling flush with cash, and that's just not true. That we do receive wildlife restoration funds for our wildlife management work. We've done that through the Pittman-Robinson Act and things of that nature, but those funds for CWD management have to be taken from somewhere else. That there's not this, once you confirm positive, then Washington says, congratulations guys, here's your check.
Let's print more money for Arkansas.
Yeah, that doesn't happen. So there has to be decisions made saying, do I take funds away from this wildlife management area or from a research project that we were going to do, or whatever activity that those wildlife restoration funds was going to be designated for, and now I have to divert them over here to pay for CWD testing, to buy supplies. I mean, how many different scalpel blades have we bought, in the years, and all these little baggies that we have to buy, and all these little things that come with it. And that's what I guess is frustrating, is because you're having to take away, especially with us being in the research division, it seems like sometimes research is the first pillar to fall, and it shouldn't be, but it is frustrating, is because you want to learn, you want to advance the science, but the funds are just not there because you've had to take from somewhere else to actually implement the plan.
Yeah, there's no doubt there's research projects we've not been able to implement because the dollars we're spending on the CWD management program, and most of those dollars come out of our research division. Certainly staff time's coming from across the board, but all the dollars for testing, all the dollars for supplies, whatever other monitoring or research we're trying to do associated with it, it's coming out. And so those are federal reimbursements. It's not new pot of money. It's the money that's intended to come back to the states, and then we got to decide how to use it. So yeah, there's no new dollars in that. One of the you said knowing the origin doesn't matter at this point, and that's one we struggled with too early on, having found it in a captive facility. And there's no doubt there's a strong correlation between where we found it in the captive facility to begin with and outside the fence. But which direction it went, we could probably say we have reasonable confidence. But the rest of them, we don't know. And frankly, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, the disease on the landscape is really, really hard to deal with. And so you get those competing voices, those in the captive servant industry that say we're being too strong in making management actions that affect them. We got the hunting public that says you're not doing enough. And it's like, no, we're trying to say this is the sources of risk. Just because they exist on the landscape doesn't mean they're inherently bad. That's right. But you got to understand, hunters too, these are the activities you're taking that are risky, right? And so how do we bridge that continuum of risk and then get back to the origin at some point? Doesn't matter. We're trying to protect the health of the deer on either side of the fence, and so how do we just move beyond those discussions and truly unify the community in addressing the issue? That's one we have struggled with, because it's always the competing, well, you're doing this to us, but what are you doing to them? And it's like, no, we should be in this thing together. We should all care enough that we're in it together.
Right.
Well, you mentioned earlier, Jason, the cost of testing, and you don't charge hunters for that. That's another one of those added costs that, this is not a lightly taken disease. The agencies are really, it's demanding manpower and outright financial costs.
Yeah, the cost is tremendous. An any deer permit in Missouri is $17. When we send a sample to the University of Missouri Diagnostic Lab, it costs us $18 to get the test run. That doesn't count all the staff cost associated with getting it. I don't know what, Cory, your guys' estimates are, but we estimate it costs anywhere from $60 to $80 for every single CWD sample, and so we're collecting in the neighborhood of $30,000 a year. It quickly overwhelms the permit sales. And even the federal reimbursement associated with that, and so we're dipping into other programs to pay for the management actions.
And it is. I mean, we're the two states that has conservation sales tax, and so we are able to have some additional funding come in, but we look at it as a service we want to provide to our hunters, and we think our hunters will appreciate that, and we really try to sell that opportunity as we want to do this for you. This is something that the state agency wishes to provide, because in return, like y'all said, we want to advance our knowledge of the disease. And so we have our own selfish reasons for that as well, but we want to make sure that we're providing a good service as a state agency to our hunters and keep them in the woods. It was brought out yesterday. We can't manage this disease without our hunters. And for me to think that I'm going to sit in my little office somewhere and just dial up some kind of magic plan that's going to do it, I can't. I need those army of hunters that we deploy every year in the fall to go out there and do what they do the best, and that's remove deer from the landscape. And so we need that. If they stop doing that, this is only going to escalate the problem of CWD.
There aren't enough Arkansas game and fish sharpshooters to go out and do the job that hunters are doing for you.
And deer are not going to look at one another and say, "Hey, I've got CWD. We may not need to breed right now." They're not going to do that. And so you got to intervene there and stop that process somehow or another. So that's one of the messages for us is it's a partnership. Come in here and let's lock arms and let's tackle this thing together, because if one of us thinks we can do it without the other, we're lost already.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, we've tried to do what we can to provide as much opportunity for our hunters to take additional deer, especially where we've found positives, because we've got to work together to accomplish this task. In a private land dominated state, we don't have the luxury of saying, oh, hey, this is a big chunk of public land. We can go in and do whatever we think needs to happen. We're trying to implement targeted culling, and it is totally at the voluntary ask of the landowner, and they've got to be willing to accept some sacrifice. And so we've tried to do what we can to give them those additional opportunities. Some of them utilize it and some of them don't, but we definitely can't do it alone. And you talked a little bit about the service to the landowner or to the hunter in terms of providing the test. We've really seen a summer of 2017 shift. And you mentioned earlier, Bronson, the human health concerns. Once the Cac Study came out and CDC changed their message about testing deer before consumption in endemic areas, it really shifted that hunters actively seeking out having their deer tested. And we've continued to say, hey, we're going to do it. We're going to provide it. And so more and more samples aren't necessarily for our surveillance program or our monitoring efforts. They purely are that peace of mind, that continue to hunt, a little bit of reassurance that the animal you're consuming, if it has a disease, it has it at a very, very low or early stage of infection. So again, that's not in many ways providing us research information, but it's trying to continue that partnership and something that they're very interested in.
Jason, could you clarify the Cac Study just briefly?
Yeah, so the Cac Study basically is a project looking at feeding. They actually fed preclinical CWD deer meat to a group of macaques, and a couple of them developed clinical symptoms of chronic wasting disease. The project's not yet complete still, so we don't have published research, but it was at least a significant enough finding that the Center for Disease Control reassessed the situation and their guidance on testing and human consumption, and try to avoid the prion if at all possible. And so that really changed the communication. I think it has changed some of the broader scale interest in chronic wasting disease. I think the things that we've seen in the last 2 years, the heightened interest, certainly additional states being positive, but that increased human health concern has really changed nationally kind of that conversation. But then it's shifted our public's response and awareness. I've seen it. I mean, prior to that, there was a lot of apathy. Post that, there's this maybe there's something more we really should be concerned about. And the CDC's decision to basically say test them before you eat them in those places is really shifted. And then it shifted the hunters' expectations. We used to struggle. We had to go to hunters to get samples. Now they are far more willing to bring deer to us to get them tested.
Yeah. And quick clarification too is that the CDC is not saying that if you consume a CWD positive deer, you're going to get they're just saying use caution.
Yep. And
that we cannot guarantee you 100%. They're just saying based on that study, there's concern. We can't. There's a non-zero probability that something could happen, and so it's just an extremely cautious viewpoint.
Yeah, it sure
to have your
is.
meat tested.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Because I was chatting with somebody the other day. We preached for quite some time that it's not a food safety test. It's not a food safety test, but it does provide some additional level of assurance. And so that conversation has just completely shifted in terms of interest from our hunters to get samples tested. And so the ask and the expectation of the agencies has just gone up. The other side of that is, okay, I've got it tested and I know I'm not going to consume it until I get a test result. The demand and the expectation for a quick turnaround time. Waiting until February like we used to do when we sent samples to SCWDS because they were doing IHC and it took a long time is no longer acceptable. We got deer at the processor, they're waiting. Mm-hmm. We got deer getting ready to go to a donation program, they're waiting in the cooler till they get a test result. And so they want them in 3 to 5 days. And it's difficult just logistically for us to get a sample and get it to the lab sometimes in 3 to 5 days, much less get a report that you can report back out to the hunter. And so that in and of itself, beyond managing the disease, managing hunter expectations, trying to do what we need to do for population management, is a tremendous burden. We probably spend as much time on some of those as we do, especially during the firearm season when things are rolling hot and heavy, to try to be responsive to that demand.
We see the same thing in we've been able to work. Our Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Lab is the lab that's always done our testing for us, and now coming into season, we're going to we've already partnered with Arkansas Livestock and Poultry Commission in Little Rock, and so that staff is geared up, and they're going to be testing, and so we hope that that's going to really maybe trim off some days of the turnaround time for our hunters. But also, I think that kind of goes back to just the void and the need for some additional science. Is I would love to have a quicker test.
Wouldn't we all?
I mean, so that's a need there in the science arena. Is let's investigate that. Is there some sort of a litmus test, a quick test? I mean, I think in a perfect world, we'd have hunters go into a gas station or whatever. You buy some drinks and your beef jerky and your hunting license, you get a handful of CWD tests, and you're ready to hit the woods. I mean, that would be a great scenario right there, and that they would be able to do these field tests. And so I mean, I'm not giving up that hope, but science has got to step in though and continue the knowledge on, push it on.
Yeah, it's just really hard to detect, these prions, and that's what's so difficult. Just like all of you, that's a really common question. Isn't there some type of blood test? Can I just take a hair sample and send it in? And man, do we wish that were the case. But science, I mean, I guess I believe, I have faith science is going to step up and catch up, and maybe in the next year, it may be a decade, but I think we will definitely have something, maybe not instantaneous, but maybe we'll have an hour turnaround or a day turnaround or something like that. But until that happens,
it's the tissue that becomes the problem, right? It's like, what tissue can we collect that's different that a hunter can do easily, and then what tests can we do outside of a lab environment, a highly controlled system. And this is one of those, again, what's the challenge of trying to communicate to our hunters is that the medical community, scientific community, has been challenged with figuring out what prion diseases are for decades. Decades.
Yeah.
We obviously have this heightened sense because of it's impacting a resource we all care about, but it's going to be, we've talked about the partnership with hunters, it's going to be state agencies and research partnerships beyond our norm, beyond the folks that we've been comfortable working with in the past to try to push that needle. And that's where some of the newer, more creative things have been coming from, is those broader medical community of we're interested, we're trying to figure out what Creutzfeldt-Jakob's looks like. I mean, the estimates of how much money has been spent trying to figure out how to better detect prion diseases outside of the cervid world is just astronomical. And so it's part of that managing expectations. Let's not have the hubris to think that, oh well, we'll figure it out. The reality is it's a challenge. It's probably going to be a paradigm shifting event. I mean, one of those truly resets our understanding, because our understanding of prion biology is far behind what bacteriology and virology and all of those things are, and from a scientific community. But there's a lot of great minds working on it. The currents of chronic wasting disease and even BSE in Europe has again reinvigorated the research community over there to start asking really tough questions. The medical community here in some ways sees CWD as a way for them to peel back the layers. You can't do experimental trials very easily on humans with prion disease. It's kind of looked down upon. It's not something we want to do. But they now have this model, and they have it's an infectious one, and so it's easier to transmit, and so it gives them some opportunity to explore. And so I think that's where we're gonna, if we see a breakthrough, it's going to be because of that partnership that's created with folks from the human health arena. That have, again, another set of vested interest in figuring out a solution.
Yeah, these issues are so technical. It's Nobel Prize level breakthroughs.
Absolutely,
is what we're talking about.
Absolutely, yeah. It'll be on the front page of Science. I mean, it's just that kind of.
It's that sophisticated. Yeah.
Well, this is our fourth episode talking about chronic wasting disease. Two just between us. In the early stages of our disease status here in Mississippi, and if you could tell our listeners, just one or two things to take home messages, Cory and Jason, what are some of the, what would you like all of our listeners to just to remember and implement?
I'd go back to the make sure that they're continuing to enjoy the resource and just plug this CWD testing into their routine. But don't give up and don't go just stay at the house. Just continue to purchase hunting license, continue to enjoy the resource, but just be wise about the animals that you harvest, what they look like when they walk into your food plot or when they walk down the deer trail you've been sitting on for hours, and just observe the health of that animal. When you're field dressing the animal, take some note as to what you're seeing, and then test it. Make sure that you work with your state agency and get that thing tested. Support your state agency in the management that they're implementing. They're not out there doing just random helter-skelter activities. They have a plan, and the plan is based off of most of what we're all using is the AFWA BMPs. And that sets a great road course for the state wildlife agencies to follow. And so that's what we're trying to implement. And so support your state wildlife agency. Realize that it is a marathon. It's not a sprint. I've said time and time again, you can hold a bobcat by tail for a little bit, but there comes a time you got to let him go. And so that's the same way with this CWD, is that you have to just settle in and realize you can't hold that bobcat that long, at that rate. You've got to settle in and run the course, but you have to do it with the hunters. And so my message to the hunters would be, continue to enjoy the resource, support your state wildlife agency, but just add CWD testing into your process that you go through when you harvest a deer.
And I really like that concept, that it's just another step in the harvest.
That's right. That's right. And we're going to try to make it as easy as you can to insert that piece into their puzzle. But yeah, go ahead and still drive it around town with the tailgate down, all that stuff that we enjoy doing. But make sure, though, that you get the lymph nodes out of it too, and bring that to the state agency.
And where would your people in Arkansas find the best information? If they were to Google Arkansas CWD, where would you direct them?
Our website is the best one-stop shop. It's agfc.com. And we have a CWD section there. We'll have all the information on drop-off locations. Those will just be freezers that we have scattered around the state. We have partnered with over 50 taxidermists in the state that will pull samples for free. Regardless, if even many of them will pull from a doe, some animal that you're not going to have taxidermy. Just take that head in there and they'll pull a sample for you. We do have some private veterinarians that will pull samples. They will not be free though. They're at a charge. These are just a service they're providing. And then our Arkansas Game and Fish Commission regional offices. Contact one of those offices. They're scattered throughout the state. Make sure a biologist is there in the office that day, but we'll pull the sample, and all that'll be free as well. But agfc.com is the best place.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a very good message, Cory. I mean, it is we got to be in it for the long haul, and what's their part? The state agencies aren't doing this because we want to be doing it. We're doing it to protect this public trust resource that we all value so much. One of our messages, I think, too, has been continue to enjoy the hunt. It may look different. We may have removed the antler point restriction. We may not be allowing you to put out feed and minerals, but there's still other ways. We enjoyed hunting long before we had all those additional tools, and so let's get back to maintain that social enjoyment of just being out in nature and being with family. And then one of the other big messages is that make sure the behaviors you're doing aren't putting other herds at risk. We talked a lot about carcass movement, and just being aware that moving carcasses and improperly disposing of them is one thing we never thought about. We just didn't. You may hunt 2 hours away, just process them, throw them out back, and just understanding those small individual risks that hunters are taking that just unknowingly could be contributing to the spread of the disease. And then, probably a little more blunt point that the decisions we make today that our children and grandchildren will judge us for. And while we may have very, very low prevalence, we've got, many of our areas, we just got a very small percentage of the deer that are infected, but the decisions we make today are going to significantly impact the course of the disease. And so we always talk about what are we going to leave to future generations. And it may be hard for you to swallow shooting some extra deer or allowing the agency to come in and shoot some extra deer. But it's protecting the resource long term so that when we do have that scientific breakthrough, I think it's going to happen. The area in which we have to try to treat or impact is so much smaller. And so work with us. We're trying to protect this very, very important tradition that's socially and economically important to so many people across the South and Midwest. Whitetail deer is the most valuable game species we have, and it's the goose that laid the golden egg in terms of broader conservation. We've talked about the funding models and those kinds of things, and so help make those really, really tough decisions and some of those individual sacrifices to hopefully protect this resource as we move forward.
And where, Jason, can your people find the best info in Missouri?
Yeah, certainly our public website, mdc.mo.gov, or just Missouri Conservation. And if you put it into Google, we've got lots and lots of information. We're very much like others, tried to be as transparent as possible. We've got lists of taxidermists and meat processors that provide that hunter-based service, just like Arkansas and many other states, and so that's our single source of information.
Thank you both.
Before we go, I want to brag just a little bit.
Sure.
We've had other guests on Deer University before that were like active graduate students in our program and some past graduate students, and we've got one today. I didn't mention to begin with, Jason Sumners got his master's degree here working on a deer project in the early 2000s.
Yeah, boy, I did.
Welcome back.
Yeah, it's been 15
sorry it's
years.
The circumstances.
Yeah, sorry the
CWD.
circumstances. Yeah, you never know where you're going to end up. But no, I appreciate, and many of the things we've been able to share with other states has been a product of that. Your initiation into the profession. So I appreciate having the opportunity to grow here and come back and meet old friends, again. So it's been good. Thanks, guys.
Well, thank you both. As always, thank you for what you do in general for deer management and at your state wildlife agency. Thank you for taking the time. You're both very, very busy. Big day for us today, so thanks for carving out a little bit of your time for this interview. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.
Natural Resources University is funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. New episodes are released every Tuesday. For more information, follow us on our social media platforms at NR_University.